brave. All right, so can we just start whenever? Do you guys care? I don't care. Great. All right, well, thank you, Phil. All right, well, welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark. I'm a senior fellow here at the Institute, and I'm also director of the Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. We are very lucky tonight to have with us Mike Fabey, who is a longtime journalist and author now of 2 books. We're talking about one of those tonight. Michael has been, he's been most recently working for Jane's and is also an editor at Jane's Fighting Ships. Previous to that, he has worked for Aviation Week and several other media outlets. In addition to that, he is also the winner of the Timothy White Award for editing, and congratulations on that, which is a prestigious award for editing in challenging circumstances. So congratulations on that, and we appreciate you being here. He's also one of the few journalists that have had a large amount of firsthand experience going to sea on ships, going out and watching naval forces operate and practice their work. Most recently, he was up in Norway, even with the Marines, looking at what the Marines were doing up there as part of the expansion of Expeditionary Advanced Base Operations. So wide-ranging of experience, both practical and as a reporter. So we're really happy to have Mike here tonight to talk about his new book, Heavy Metal, which is about the hard days and nights of the shipyard workers that build the America's supercarriers. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight, but thank you very much, Mike, for being here. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So to start with, I wanted to ask you kind of a big overarching question of why did you want to write a book about Newport News? You've got a long history there. I assume that's part of what led you to this decision.
Yeah, that's exactly the case. Way back when we first got married, back in the late 80s, I had a job interview at the Daily Press, a local paper down there in Newport News, and I was driving around, kind of lay of the land type of thing. And I went down the road and I just came across a cityscape where you can see the carrier silhouetted, and I'm like, let's stop the car. I mean, I grew up in Philly. I was used to large cityscapes and everything, but this was different. I was just like, what is going on here? And it just fascinated me. And so after that, I just really need to find out who worked in there, how they did this work, and it just kind of snowballed from there. So I was bound and determined, and eventually came back into the city and the paper after working other places for a while and covered the yard.
And so you covered the yard for a long time as a reporter locally.
Yes.
But then you stepped back and you worked, at national media. Your last book focused on the South China Sea, Crashback, which was a terrific read for all you guys. So why did it take so long for you to come back to the carriers? I guess my point is you've written a lot about things outside of the yard.
Right.
You wrote about the South China Sea extensively. You wrote about events internationally and for Jane's Fighting Ships, but now you finally have come back to the roots.
A couple of things. One is for Jane's, I was covering the yard again. I mean, not as extensively as I would at the local paper, but still starting to cover it again. And at the same time, like everything seemed to be like what was going on with the whole new carrier, with the country deciding what they were going to do with carriers, what they weren't going to do with carriers. And also my agent and I were kind of like thinking aloud to ourselves and to each other and everything, what should the next book be about? And quite honestly, I had started a project down there. It was going to be a long series about how the union got started at the yard. It never got published. And I wanted to find a home for that. And so I showed him some of the writing on that. And the characters from that just leapt out at him as they did at me when I met them. And from there, we said, we got to tell the story.
So the reason why the shipyard is in the news a lot today is the challenges with being able to build supercarriers now in a challenging technological threat and financial environment. The Ford had famously had a lot of problems due to a pretty aggressive effort to introduce new technologies into the carrier that would cut it, set it apart from its predecessors like the Nimitz class carriers. But you chose to write about the Kennedy, which is the second in the class, when I think most people would have gravitated to the Ford and treated it as this interesting case of the military run amok. So why did you choose the Kennedy?
So initially, we were going to do the Reagan. CVN 76, which had been a couple before the Ford. because I was at the yard at that time, so I knew all the characters. It honestly had been an easy write. Plus, there were a lot of things were going on with the Reagan. The union had given up union concessions in order to get the contract and everything like that. And that's what we initially wanted to do. And then when we were going out and shopping the book, the editor at HarperCollins said, I want something a little bit more current than that, of course. And so the Ford had already been out there. Right. And it was like, well, they are building right now, as we speak, the Kennedy right there. And he said, well, let's do that. Let's focus on something as they're building it, as opposed to something that's already out at sea. And then it just took off from there.
So to talk a little bit about the Kennedy now. Mm-hmm. So you highlight in the book some of the challenges that they had in building the ship, because it seems like second-in-class ships should have easier sailing, than the first-in-class. Less new stuff. Technology should have been ironed out. Maybe we figured out some of the ins and outs of building the ship. But Kennedy still has had its share of problems in terms of just getting the ship built. It doesn't help to have a pandemic in the middle of it. There's a lot of other issues. So what were some of the challenges you found that the shipyard workers had to contend with as they were building this second-in-class ship? So
with the Kennedy, first of all, I mean, with some of the things to Ford, they had to iron out, and now they were testing those fixes on the Kennedy. And in some cases, those fixes didn't quite work out. And you had a lot of cases where the master shipbuilders would take a look at something that was on the diagram and say, yeah, it ain't going to work. and oh, no, come together, of course. So that was part of it. And the other part of it was there was this very aggressive desire by the Navy to get that ship cut with a decrease in manpower, they call man hours. Up to like 18% they wanted to do. It's almost a fifth. So they want to build this next new carrier, fix all the problems you have from the first carrier with fewer people. And that put an awful lot of pressure on it. Oh, by the way, if you do that, they dangle this, we'll give you possibly this 2-contract deal for carriers. If you don't, who knows where we're going to go from here. At that point in time, if you have another Ford type of situation, well, that could be it for the carrier program.
Right. So for the workers down there, so how does this impact the workers? So you've got, the Navy sets up this situation where they're trying to drive a lot of new technology into the program. It's a lot of different things on the ship relative to Nimitz-class carriers. They're trying to cut costs at the same time. So for it kind of all falls to the workers, really. Aren't they where that rubber meets the road when it comes to trying to translate aggressive schedules and technology insertion with financial constraints?
They are, and they have very much this, as we say, the back cover jacket cover, the book, this can-do kind of a spirit about them. They really do. It's a realistic one, quite honestly. They will be the first to tell you, we can do that, but it's going to take this much extra, or whatever. Mm-hmm. But there was this real sense of, look, they have a real sense of, this is Newport News. We build carriers. We build them right. And they were more upset by some of the things that had happened with the Ford in terms of the idea that they didn't build such a good ship, because there were a lot of things that went into that's kind of a debatable point. And so they really wanted to do the Kennedy right. They were more focused on that, more focused on we're going to do this ship right. At the lowest level, especially at mid-management level, the guys who come up through the ranks of the waterfront really focused on that.
That pressure that they were feeling, but they were obviously trying to meet that challenge. How was that shaped by the experience with the Ford? Did the shipyard workers feel like when they were building Ford that they're building something that was going to have some trouble down the line when it came to testing and actually getting the ship?
No, I don't think they felt that at all, to tell you the truth. I mean, an awful lot of the systems that went on there were not their systems. Now, if you look at, for example, the new way they were launching and recovering the aircraft, for example, came from General Atomics. So that wasn't, they installed it, and there was never a question about the installation, right, which is what they do. Now, the one thing I think that they really did feel was the weapons elevators, because that is something they do. And the fact that wouldn't work right, and at the end, that's what was holding up the ship. And you had Secretary Spencer one time saying, "Well, fire me if you don't get them right," and everything like that. They felt that pressure. That was something they really took to heart. I mean, that's what they tell me. I mean, I really have to kind of like step back and say, look, I'm not a shipbuilder. I can only tell their stories. But that's certainly what they were telling me, time and again. No, that's not right. We're going to get this right. And that's what they felt about the King. We're going to get this right.
So they didn't feel like the Navy had kind of set them up, or the government, I mean, not the Navy, the government had sort of set them up to fail a little bit because of the pressures that they were being put under, the cost constraints and the...
I didn't get the feeling they felt, I mean, they look at the Navy as more like a partner when it's at that level. Basically, you have the Navy supervisors down to the yard, and there's a pretty good relationship now. They're not used to be, but there is now. And so I think they looked at more as a partnership. There was a real sense of like, we really have to work together on getting this right. So I think that was more of that sense than this whole, oh, we're being set up. Now, later on, when Secretary Spencer called them out on it, and really sort of put the whole onus on them, especially about the elevators, that was a different story because, quite honestly, the Navy felt that the elevators would be no problem. The shipbuilders felt that the elevators would be no problem, and it was a problem. They both shared a lot of responsibility for that, and Spencer really just put the whole onus on the shipyard, and that really rankled.
Right. So how does that, how does the experience that these shipyard workers had with the Ford class, which is this new ship? There's a lot of challenges involved in building it. Obviously, we've heard about those and been reported. Compared to the Nimitz class, where by the end of it, I guess I would have to assume that it was getting pretty rote because they were getting the prices down. It seemed like it was happening pretty smoothly, but I don't know if that's really the case. Was there a market, did they feel like this was like night and day comparing their experience on Ford and Kennedy with what they did on Nimitz?
Well, what was interesting, and especially I want to talk more about the Kennedy with this, because that's where you really saw the difference, is that for the Nimitz class, which were built an awful lot during the Cold War, I mean, the focus is on just building a really good carrier. The cost really wasn't as huge of a factor. When they got to the Ford, cost started to be a factor, and when you got to Kennedy, cost was a real factor. And they start to actually look at things that they'd never done before, which is almost create like a Ford-style production line. You can't do it for carriers, but you can do it for different parts of carriers. And they start doing like different sections of the ship. They would line up the worker in such a way it was almost creating this type of production line feel to it. Mm-hmm. And they were really starting to like look into the processes. That was what was really different about the Kennedy, especially looking at the actual processes of what they were doing to do a whole different way of shipbuilding. Right. And on top of that, incorporating this whole digital part of it before. Before it was the shipbuilder. He came, he learned his craft, and he taught it to the next person. Now you have all this digital stuff, and they were learning basically by YouTube some. And it's a little more fancier than that, sophisticated, but essentially the same thing. And they were incorporating that into it. And there was a lot of like push and pull about that. And I think there still is, but that is actually where they're going with that. And they kind of, in some ways see a challenge, especially the younger shipbuilders. They see this as something that's kind of cool and fun.
Right. Which so it's interesting you mentioned that because I was going to ask about the idea that shipbuilding is really an art in a lot of ways. There's a lot of artisanship involved as opposed to just a manufacturing type business. But smaller ships, they can be increasingly look like an assembly line, where the ship can roll through. Like a littoral combat ship is an example where you can build those a little bit more in a serial production way, like you build airplanes or cars. But a carrier is just so large, you're stick building it like a house, it seems. Whenever you start one from scratch, you're having to assemble it as opposed to move it through a production line.
Right, but within the carrier, within that, you have an awful lot. Parts of different ships are like plates, sections of the ship, piping, the way the piping fixed together. I mean, a ship is made basically a lot of empty spaces within these compartments. And that's where you can get into that kind of feel where you're actually having a production line for these different parts of the ship.
So did you find that the shipyard workers that they had started to get comfortable with a particular part of the production line? They felt like I got a handle on this is my thing, this is what I'm going to do. Or do they feel like they get pulled off to do different jobs that maybe are not in their wheelhouse, or that they get pulled out to do different tasks that maybe aren't the thing they normally do day to day?
And I mean, for the most part, so they're going to be different. Like electricians be doing a certain thing at a certain time on the carrier, day in, day out for a long time. what I found is that, especially when it came from the digital part, so before, I mean, there's a few 100,000 studs all throughout a carrier, and they would have to climb up ladders and do that by back-breaking work and do that by hand. But now, because when the computers were coming in, you're actually doing that with the plasma burners when they first come up the line. And so now they're just like putting the lines in as opposed to doing all that hard work before. And they found that to be very cool. I mean, that kind of thing where they like, wow, this is right here. And you would have like parts that were waiting on the platen, as they call it, the right side of the dock where they're building certain parts of the ship. They would have that all waiting there for them, you know, day in and day out, whereas before they have to go out and get it because they know what parts might need, because certain things might be done, may not be done in time, that kind of thing. So that kind of thing really did take off.
So those kinds of advancements, you know, to get to more of the labor questions, you know, those advancements in how shipbuilding has become, you know, easier for the shipbuilder and maybe a you know, more attractive working environment. How has that changed the environment for recruiting and retaining people in the shipyard? Because everybody's having a problem being able to get workers today, and you know, shipbuilding is not like working at Starbucks. You know, it's obviously pays a little bit better probably, but you know, it's a much different environment. It's a more challenging environment. So how is that affecting recruiting and retention? How do these workers see their?
They're trying to bring them in basically by kind of saying we are on the cutting edge.
Right.
You know, we are offering different kinds of manufacturing, and even within that, I mean, if you want to get into the electronic, you know, all that kind of thing, you can come here and learn that. And so that is what they're selling. Mm-hmm. But like you said, awful lot of people are selling that.
Right.
And to be perfectly honest, they can make a lot more money even going up the road to like Anheuser-Busch.
Right.
You know, so it really is not this very lucrative job. I mean, it was more lucrative than a lot had seen, especially generational shipbuilders when they came from like dirt farms and stuff like that in the Carolinas and things like that. But it's still not very lucrative. And so they can make more money elsewhere, and that's been the problem. But they are starting to bring in some of these younger workers with this whole idea of, you know, we're in the digital age now. We're getting into this, and that is attracting some. But they just announced just the other day they're hiring like 5,000. Contract they just put out, they signed it, let's see, a quarter ago. It was all kinds of different types of benefits in there. I mean, so you can advance very quickly in order to keep workers, you know, especially ones that have been there for a year or two, and entice new workers in. So it's a tough nut right now for them.
So, I mean, so you mentioned the Anheuser-Busch breweries. Are there other employers in the area that?
Well, they said the big three down there, they say, is going to be Walmart, the military, the yard. I mean, so that's what, you know, that's the kind of like, but having said that, for Huntington Ingalls Industries, which now HII, just opened this brand new unmanned center down there. And I'm sure there's going to be some kind of back and forth between the two. You know, that's going to be very enticing for them. That's on a very serious cutting edge. But so, I mean, there are a few places down there, but it's still kind of, you know, everyone knows the yard. I mean, everyone, you know, just about everyone has someone, you know, family works in the yard, friends work in the yard. It's still that kind of place.
So you know, talking about that, you bring out some stories of, you know, some of the characters that you met with down there and that you've known over the years. So there's multi-generation people down there who are working like the third or fourth generation at the shipyard. Did they see the shipyard as being, you know, a generational like responsibility almost, like this is how we contribute to national security, and I'm going to go work at the yard, or did they see this as like the best option they had of other options? Well,
to your first point, most of the shipyard workers are very patriotic. They really are. It's amazing when you talk to them. For a lot of them, it's not this is my 9-to-5 job, because I mean, it's not a place you really work 9 to 5. Your head's on the swivel. You go in there, and your main idea is, first of all, is go in and just build a great ship. Why? Because it represents our country, because sailors are going to depend thousands of their lives on what you do. But also, you want to leave that yard alive and in one piece, and just importantly, they want their workmates to leave alive in one piece. But that patriotic kind of feel is always there for them. It really is. The other, with the generational people, there's a mix, as most anywhere else. I mean, 30,000 workers there, so it's not all going to be cookie cutter. There's some who are like, yeah, my dad worked at the yard, my grandfather worked at the yard, so I'm going to work at the yard. There are others who their father worked at the yard, and they were bound and determined not to work at the yard. And then they would wind up working at the yard. You know, I mean, you know, it is that kind of thing. So but even that, I really, none of the ones I met had this, yes, I'm gonna punch the clock, I'm gonna do my stuff and get out. I really didn't meet anyone like that at all. They really, you know, and I think they'd be weaned out if they were. I really do, because it's that kind of place. It's the kind of place, if you have that kind of attitude, someone's probably gonna get hurt.
Yeah. Well, also, do you find that you know, the other shipyard workers are going to hold each other accountable, right? So if you are a slacker, it's your teammates that are going to call you out on it, more so than your supervisor, probably.
Absolutely. If you don't do a good job, you know, you'll find out from someone else before the supervisor gets to you.
Right.
You know, I mean, it's that kind of place. But it's not a place. I mean, it's not like, you know, everyone's fighting with each other and stuff. There's some parts in the book where there's some work rules that like really kind of like, you know, if you're a painter, you can be painting within a certain distance of a hot spark. You know, someone's doing hot metal work, but if you're a hot metal worker, you have to be farther away. That's changed recently, but that was the way it was for years. And so someone came down, opened a paint can. The guy was doing some hot welding, something. He'd have to put his torch and leave for a shift. You know, go do something else. I mean, and it's not a kind of place, oh, I'll do this or job next. I mean, you get a work order, you have that job to do.
Right.
And, you know, you have to go back to your supervisor, and all they want to know is, did you do that job? So there's some of that, but there's not like, you know, a lot of like infighting and stuff like that. I mean, they have different beliefs. I mean, they go down there during it's called cultural chaos, the partisan politics of the last few years. I mean, in a yard where you have 30,000 workers on any given day, it's like a small city. So you're going to have that kind of like broad range of politics, religion, everything like that, all looking at it differently. And when they come through the gate, honestly, they leave that at the gate. They have to, for the reason I said before, they really do.
So you talk a little bit about in the book about some of the, you know, in the history of the yard, it's experienced every phase of American disorder and you know, upset that we've experienced on the outside of the yard. So you know, back in the 60s, you know, there was a lot of friction in the yard, wasn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, so the yard essentially, you know, for early years, kind of basically was like a plantation system, as were most large industrial plants in the South, and this is in the South. And so you had that, and to get a union in there, as you know, I mean, you know, talking union, you might as well say, let's bring communism into the place. I mean, that's the way they felt. And so there were, I mean, you had one episode called Bloody Monday, where you had one of the workers take away in an ambulance and heads were getting busted. State police were there. It was that kind of thing. It went up to Supreme Court, some decisions, to get the union in there the way it did. It was not an easy move at all.
And so now jumping forward a little bit to today, so you know, labor's having, you know, a bit of a resurgence. You know, we're seeing unionization efforts at companies that, you know, tech companies that previously thought they were immune to that kind of pressure. Yeah, and we're seeing unions and industrial concerns become stronger. So how is that affecting you know, Huntington Ingalls and the, you know, Newport News Shipyard?
Well, what seems to be, I mean, and especially look at the last contract. First of all, they were able to really get up the membership at the steelworkers there, highest level they've had. I mean, it was the way they were able to recruit, and they always recruit large when they're going in for union negotiations, but this was really, especially during COVID and everything like that. And again, I said they got some provisions in there that really kind of, you know, sweetened the pot. They got some better pensions. And then they got something that was really near and dear to their hearts, is that they wanted a bonus for working during COVID. They wanted that acknowledged, and they got it. And that to them was something that was so important. That was one of the things that, because the yard had to stay open, because as I was told, you can't Zoom a weld. And they were determined to be essential workers. And so the cry became, during the union negotiations and the breakdown in negotiations, of essential pay for essential workers. And basically, we're essential workers, then they acknowledged that. And they were able to get that. So I think that the union itself is feeling its oats in terms of what's going on today. We'll see how far that goes, but I think they're stronger now than they have been in the recent memory anyway.
So is that, and how long is that contract going to be in place for?
5 years now.
5 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so Newport News builds, submarines as well. And I think there's been some, back and forth. People get to go back and forth between submarine and
All the
carrier
time.
construction to a degree.
Right.
Which, is that something the union? I mean, so is that attractive? Do workers like the idea of being able to, go back and forth, or do they kind of, is it seen as sort of a hassle?
I mean, so with sub work, so much like deep down in the bows and everything like that, and it's really just not the most pleasant work, so they don't like that part of it. Right. But the work itself, doing the actual work itself, what they're happy to see is, quite honestly, the yard have contracts. Yeah. I mean, really, that's what it's all about. I mean, that's how they keep the workforce going and everything like that.
So now they're taking, but also Newport News is taking on ship repair work, so submarine repair work, because our public shipyards are so backed up that some of our poor Los Angeles class attack submarines are having to go into the private shipyards to finally get work done to them.
Right.
How is that effort going in terms of feathering those in to the workload that these workers are having to?
As you heard me say, they're trying to hire 5,000 workers now.
Right. Right.
I mean, right now there's no doubt about there's as they call it, capacity issue. There's just not enough workers to do all the work they have coming. I mean, and they're really trying to hire for that.
And it's a different kind of work too. I think that the issue might also be it's not as easy to take somebody from a construction job and put them on a repair job, because everything's starting from scratch.
So as you look for the book, you'll see a lot of the top managers, especially middle manager types, who went to the Kennedy had been on overhauls for the previous carriers. So there is a back and forth there. When you're working as little compartments, it almost doesn't matter necessarily. I mean, it matters sometimes to get into the ship. That's where you're going to have to do some cutting and stuff like that, as opposed to building a ship up and putting it all together. You have to cut into a ship and pull things out. Right. So there's going to be a learning curve for that for them. But I think once they're in there, it's really a lot of similar kind of work.
Right. So just so the audience knows, so I'll turn to you. We'll do some audience questions here in a minute. Someone's doing construction also. But yeah, we'll come to you for questions in a minute. So if you have questions, start thinking about those, and signal to me that you have them so I know to turn to you. And we'll have somebody come around with the microphone. One area there's been a lot of concern across the entire military is suicide, and we had a spate of suicides on the George Washington, which is in the shipyard.
That's right.
Nearing the end of its RCOH.
Yeah.
How does part of that? I assume some of the contributing factors are the conditions for crews that are undergoing RCOH are not terrific. So did you get any opportunity to kind of interact with the crews on RCOH ships and see what their lives are like?
I mean, well, I've been wondering about that myself, because while that is true, I can tell you that when they were building the Ford, they had something they called the Plywood Palace, that they had to go and live on the Ford, and basically it was a rotten hell. Then the way they described it, I mean, it was like fungus growing in there. The walls were full of moisture. It was hot. People got sick. So there's a lot of that. They've been doing these RCOHs, these overhauls for years, decades. And this is the first time we've had anything like this. Right. It's also the first time we're in the middle of a pandemic. So the first time we're in a pandemic, middle of this, while I have all this cultural stuff going on. Right. It seems to me. It seems to me that there's nothing necessarily per se that has to do with a ship overhaul that creates the situation for this. Nothing that I've seen anyway. But I will say again, I'm not a shipbuilder. I can only tell their stories. But and dealing with the sailors, I've dealt with a lot of sailors doing this kind of work or involved in this kind of work at the same time, and shipyard workers. There's nothing seen that suggests that, hey, this is why we would choose this opt this way out. Right. But life in the shipyard as a crew member is difficult. I mean, and normally that's not. It's a relatively short time period. But if you're talking RCOH, you're talking a submarine overhaul, an ERO, you're looking at multiple years, right. Of being there. And so, and if you're living off
off base or whatever, you're good. But it seems like one of the challenges of Newport News is it's not a base. So you're not, have all the base amenities. You can't just, live in
No
the
amenities
DQ, right?
like
So
that,
DQ.
right? Yeah.
So I think that, it seems like that's a challenging environment to be a sailor. That's,
It is.
That is the next couple of years of your life.
Yeah, I mean, so for the most part, most sailors, well, you know better than I would. As a whole, I joined the Navy to see the world, and you're seeing Newport News. I mean, there's this old song about called Newport News Blues, which is a long way from New York. And you don't have any amenities, like you said. So it's certainly not a great place. Now, some people who are around there like it because they're not at sea and they can be close to their families.
Sure.
So I found people with families are actually like, this is good. I can go home at night and see my family. That's a good thing. But a lot of the people I talk to who are either attached to something like the Kennedy, which is, as they call PCU, a pre-commissioned unit ship that's not out to sea yet, or something that's going on one of these big overhauls, they're like, I just want to be at sea. This is, I'm stuck here in Newport News,
Right.
I'm not from here. I mean, and that's the thing, is that, people, the shipbuilders, for the most part, are from around that area, and that's their home. Well, for sailors, it's not.
Right. I understand that. So stepping back a little bit here and talking about carriers, there's been a lot of discussion about the future of aircraft carriers and whether the Navy needs them or whether they still are relevant in an environment where precision weapons can hold them at risk thousands of miles away from a coast, such as China's coast. Does that affect the people that work at the yard? Do they see that and start to wonder, what's my long-term viability here? Because you've got multiple generations of people who've been building ships there, and there may be a time on the horizon where the Navy says, well, maybe we don't need as many carriers.
When you talk to them, they're kind of like, I've seen this movie too. I mean, you go back to Clinton years, and they were talking about, well, it's time to cut down on the carrier force. I think you just came out to the paper recently about how you can use carriers differently. Right. And I think they've seen that. I think it seems to me in talking to them that they don't think this country's ready to give up on carriers yet. That is, as far as they can tell, is still hey, where are the carriers? When everything's going to Ukraine, one of the first things they did was send a carrier abroad, and we publicized it. I mean, that's just the way we operate even still. And that's what they say. I mean, they hear a lot of talk, but what they say in action is carriers are still out there doing all the stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, and then putting your Jane's hat on a little bit and your author of Crashback hat on. So what was your experience when you were working on Crashback, for example, and talking with Chinese officials and people who actually are out in that region? What was their perception of U.S. carriers, their value?
I mean, the value of them is the very presence of them. I mean, nothing says we're here like that silhouette coming over the horizon, where it's an ally or something like China. I mean, the very existence of them was what gave, it said, we're here, we care, this is our skin in the game. We've got 5,000 Americans on this ship. If anyone does something about that, well, that's a tripwire, that's a game changer, it's do something. And that's the way they really looked at it. And in China especially, it was just like, that's one of the reasons they keep on trying to force U.S. presence back away. And they keep on talking and touting all their missiles and stuff like that. And I still say, well, we haven't really seen a really good test of those things. So, I mean, and not for anything, but until you go out and test it and prove it work,
right,
you're just talking. That's the way I looked at it. But in talking to our allies out there, and the feeling I get from the Chinese is like, yeah, I mean, when you have something like the carrier around, it's two things, quite honestly. One is the carrier, and two is Marines. Marines on the ground, they have Mystique out there, same kind of thing. Oh, the Marines are here. Same thing. Carrier's like, okay, now we know the Americans are here.
Right. So it's a way of showing resolve and showing that you're serious.
Right.
I think, like our study would argue, is that it matters a lot what goes on the carrier, right?
Sure.
So it's a matter of the payload rather than the platform that underlies it.
At war,
Right.
When you get into, and that's the one thing I have when you get into these different studies and stuff like that, is you're always talking about when we're at war with China, this is what we got to worry about. And the counter argument, and what I kind of agree with is, but if you have a carrier out there that kind of, before you get to it, that's what, prevents the situation from escalating, really. It does. It's sort of, I almost call it information warfare, not information rather, but message warfare. This is the message we're sending out. And that's the way I think that a lot of the folks look at it. We, in the kind of the Western democracy, say war is when the missiles are flying.
Right.
The Chinese are like, no.
Yeah.
I mean, they've been at war with us since Clinton sent 2 carrier groups over to stop the missile test against Taiwan in the late 90s. I mean, they have been at war. It's not missiles flying,
Right.
but it's, in their mind, war.
Yeah. It's a confrontation. I mean,
Yes.
this confrontation's been going on for a while. So I want to turn to the audience if there's questions. So I'll start with Pat, host, if you want to bring the, and please state your name and affiliation, even though I just said your name.
You hear me? Pat Host, I'm a spokesman for Institute. I used to work with Mike. So Bryan stole my question on the future of carriers. So my follow-up question is, what are we looking at here in the photo? I have no idea what is going on here in the photo, but I would like to know.
So this is one of the first big super lifts for the carrier. Super lift is basically when they take a bunch of ship parts, sections, really not parts, sections, big sections, put them all together. And the big blue crane, as they call it, this huge gantry crane, it's big in the hemisphere, comes over, picks this up and puts it right in the middle. That one would have carried some nuclear power plant stuff. And that's going into dry dock 12, where they put the gallery together.
Great question, Pat. I wish I had asked that. Thanks. I should have asked that.
Exactly.
Sir, yes, there. Oh, it's right there.
Yeah, hi, Mike Iroshis, no affiliation. That was my question. How many more pieces of that would be involved?
For a giant super lift, roughly, so they cut it down for this one, and somewhere around, I think, 200 now. It was several hundred before. I think that's about right. About 200 of these, like, I mean, they have much bigger lifts than this even.
Second question. I know barnacles buildup on the hull has always been a problem in the past. Have they been able to resolve that with some kind of?
Well, when they're building this, they not have to worry about barnacles. I really don't. I mean, I know they're working on things when the ship's in the water, but this isn't a dry dock.
I know dry dock, but when they do have barnacle buildup, do they do something during the construction to try to preclude the buildup of barnacles?
It takes so long to build this that there's not much they can do at that,
Yeah, the paint scheme they use is supposed to make it so that it's harder for sea life to adhere to the hull. But when you bring it into dry dock and wash it off, there's still some stuff that's on there, but it definitely cuts it down.
Well, how often would they have to clean the barnacles off the hull?
Every 8 years or so when they dry dock it.
8 years?
Yeah.
I wouldn't know that one. Thank you. I just know about putting them together. Well, I don't. I know people who know how to put them.
Other questions from the audience? You can, oh, there you go.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm a student at GW. And my question is about, I guess, the theoretical increased demand for polar class ships and how you think that would, if that were to happen in the near future, how would that impact the shipbuilding industry?
Which class?
The polar class cutter.
Primarily.
Oh, okay, the polar security cutters.
Yeah.
I mean,
Stumble on another area that might.
Yeah, so I mean, for carriers, they had a carrier go up. See, 2 years ago, 1 year ago now, they've had a carrier go up to the high north. It's really hard to operate carriers, new carrier operations in the high north. So the polar security ones are the ones they are counting on for for the Coast Guard to go up there, and I mean they're supposed to basically be able to do ice breaking and do some low-level military operations too, and I think they're a great idea. So hopefully they'll get the build that they want.
So from the shipbuilding industry perspective, though, those are being built by VT Halter down in Pascagoula, and those kinds of ships are the kinds of ships that there is actually a lot of capacity to build in the United States. So the shipyards that build things like the Polar Security Cutter are the ones that are actually having trouble today because there's not very many shipyards in the U.S. still, and they get very little work. And so any work they can get from the Coast Guard is going to be very welcome to keep them in business. And we kind of need those shipyards to stay in business, though, because when we turn around and need a new government ship built that's smaller and maybe built to commercial standards, they won't be there if we don't keep them in business in between times. So, other questions? Oh, did you have a question, Tom? Yes, he's right behind you.
Tom Callender, General Dynamics. So you were there during when COVID hit and the pandemic. So I just be interested in hearing your perspective of how the shipyard workers reacted to the pandemic. They were still going to work every day and things like that. So just any insights that you saw of their attitude and things like that they went through then?
So, I mean, their attitude was, all right, we have to go. I mean, that was it. I mean, we're declared essential workers. We have to go. Some could not. I mean, and there was a liberal leave policy. So they basically, I think Danny probably would know the numbers now more than I would bet behind you of how many stayed home. Do Danny know what the attendance was like during the COVID? I'm putting you on the spot. Because they kept on changing when I would ask them. So. The number that stayed home. Okay. So some stayed home. Okay. For enterprise, they're going to do about 320 for this enterprise. It was higher for JFK and it was higher for Ford. It's slowly decreasing. Right down. For the number of folks, Danny's he's the guru for all things Newport News and HII right now. So the thing is that the yard create a different shift system. They create different, instead of everyone coming in that initial shift, they put workers out through different shifts, so we have fewer in a yard, working in certain places, certain times. Some of the supervisors even could not go into the yard because of their immune system problems. So they would come in when the workers weren't there to check over their work. So there was a whole bunch of different things they put into place. And this all became about because Jennifer Boykin, who's the president down there, basically got together these teams of all different parts within building the ship to come up with a plan of how they could still build the ship and keep the workers safe as possible. And they sat down with the union folks and they were able to put something together that really addressed them. On top of that, Jennifer Boykin basically, she would open up the questions. They could email questions to her. She was reaching out to them digitally and everything like that. So to create this kind of transparency that even some people really thought she went too far in being transparent, but it really kept the workers on a kind of level like, okay, the yard actually cares about us.
So, which brings up a interesting point is as we move into they need to hire a lot more workers to accommodate the sustained demand for carriers and also the increased demand for repair on the submarine side. Are they pursuing initiatives to try to get these folks on board, or how aggressively they're going out and trying to court these new workers? Because they're not going to necessarily be able to come from the Hampton Roads area. They're going to have to try to bring them in
they've
from
been pretty aggressive. They've been recruiting out and through schools, right, Danny? Schools, colleges. They did a tie-in with Top Gun movie, as they for an email, sending it out. So they're reaching out there. I mean, their apprentice school is one. I mean, it's one of the top in the country. Period. I mean, I know people get baseball scholarships, for example, play down there, and they play collegiate level. So they've been pursuing this aggressively as you can imagine, because they need a lot of workers.
So are the the Hampton Roads area has been growing and becoming a little more expensive, and is the overall economic development down the Hampton Roads area becoming an issue for the shipyard, which used to be able to tap into a relatively low cost of living area, but that's changing because of the overall character of the region changing.
Yeah, I would say it's already changed a lot. And the workers come from pretty far afield even. I mean, you get a lot come up from the Carolinas. Right. You have some come over from the Middle Peninsula, and those areas haven't changed as drastically, like that, for example. I mean, I haven't heard from any of the workers around there that they're like, being priced out of a job there in Newport News. That's something I haven't heard. So I don't think so. That's something if they were, they would talk about it.
Right.
You know, a lot of people were leaving the area for other reasons, had to do, again, the cultural chaos of things and stuff like that, but not for that reason.
I mean, so was it? I mean, so it seems like a kind of a sleepy backwater a little bit compared to what happened here in Washington. Was it
Oh,
a little bit more
they
chaotic
closed
down
down the highway there. They had some marches that were going on during the summer. Everything exploded after the Floyd incident, stuff like that. So there was still plenty of stuff that was going on in Newport News. I mean, not like we had in DC and make national news that way, but I mean, especially for Newport News, it was definitely something that it hit the TV sets and got everyone's attention.
Right, right. So the Navy seems to be, doubling, not doubling, I guess kind of doubling down on the carrier fleet by buying the two next ones in a multi-block or multi-ship block buy. So that gives them work out into the 2030s. Does that help with the recruiting? Do you think,
Absolutely.
Do like the
Sure.
shipyard workers pick up on those
Absolutely.
kinds of
I mean,
things?
anytime you can basically say you have guaranteed your work for a while, that's one of the things in talking to the workers, is the ones that have, I'll tell you where I think it helps is the people who've been there for like 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years kind of thing, where they're looking at like, if I stay here long enough and this work will keep me going until I can get a pension, for example, which is why pensions were pretty important in the last union negotiations. So I think that's becoming a big thing for that mid-level type of thing. I'm not sure the people coming in are, a lot of them from talking to some of the ones who've just come in, it's like, I'm gonna come in and see what it's like. Maybe I'll stay here, maybe I won't. So the very fact that they could have work going out for a long time,
Doesn't matter.
it doesn't matter as much to them.
So who did you talk to the shipyard that had been working there the longest and seemed like the old man or old woman of the line?
So there actually, I would say there were a couple. One was Lee Murphy, one was Big Ed Elliott, who actually passed away while I was doing the book, so that was a shame. Those were the two who had been there, they were that multi-generational. I got to talk to them and their sons and that kind of thing.
And so they kind of saw the yard as not just as a place to kind of grow and develop as a worker.
Family.
Did they,
That was
move
their
up through
family. That was their family. I mean, there's definitely that sense down there of this. If you get a couple of yard workers to meet each other at supermarket or something like that, forget it. They're just going to talk. Even they saw each other the day before.
So and you've been a reporter for a long time. So you've seen a lot. You've talked to a lot of people, looked at a lot of different labor environments. Is what I'm thinking.
Okay.
How do you compare what you've seen at Newport News with what you see, in other industrial settings? I mean, because you see the car industry, seems to have changed a lot and become much more, less like a family sort of environment, more like just a job where you're gonna go into the.
I get back to what I was saying in the beginning that it seems like a lot of places that I've just seen in covering places and talking to people, there's a lot of a punch in the clock kind of thing. I mean, there are some who they've been around forever and stuff, and a lot more cynical about things and stuff. There's plenty of cynics on the waterfront at Newport News. I mean, but there is just that sense of very few people, if you're working in a car plant and you see a new Bronco on the TV commercial, who cares? I mean, really, yes, sir. But, for these people, they will, a carrot, they show a picture of a carrot out at sea on something, I built that. Mm-hmm. I did that. That is the sense that everyone these ships goes out there is like all the workforce is going out with it.
Right.
And it's like they're on that ship. That ship is almost their child, if you will. It carries the whole yard with them and all that workforce too. That's just the way I feel. A lot of them anyway.
That's impressive. So other questions from the audience? I want to make sure I.
Anyway, I just wanted to ask if you could share with us a story of maybe one of your favorite characters in the book and tell us about some of the people involved in building the ships.
Yeah, my favorite was someone who basically kind of really got the ball rolling on this kind of book. And is a guy named Bill Bowser. Bill basically is probably the most instrumental worker in bringing in steel workers into the yard. Bill had grown up down in the Newport News Hampton area, back in the 50s and 60s, and he was essentially a disciple of Malcolm X. And his idea was to go in the yard and quite honestly bring black power in the yard. That's what he wanted to do. That's what he was all about. And then once he actually got in there and started working there, he realized that all these other workers, I mean, there was a lot of inequalities there, but still they were all facing a lot of the same things, a lot of the same challenges on the waterfront, the tough work and everything like that. And the more he went in there, he said, the more he realized that it wasn't black against white. It was the blue, as in blue collar, against the white shirts. It was unionist management, and that yard could no longer be a plantation system. In his mind, his view, it had to basically start really recognizing the workers for what they did. And so he just kind of like shut aside all the stuff that he had thought he'd been about, got together with another white worker there in Russell Axum, and the two of them would go out to these areas around in the Newport News area, up in the Middle Peninsula, in places like Gloucester, where he was told more than one occasion, when the sun goes down, you better be gone, kind of thing. And he just kept the drive up to get the steel workers in there. He's the one who was on the front line at that Bloody Monday. He was the worker who was actually led away in an ambulance after being just knocked to the ground and really kind of put a hurting on him, and was the one that just basically just changed his whole way of viewing life, from working that yard to creating a better workforce, and not a working environment and everything like that. And seeing that and talking to him, that was the one thing that really got me, was that it was all about after that, everyone was a brother worker. That's we called everyone. They went from they used to call him Little Castro, and then he was almost like this Moses-like figure at certain periods of time. So he was probably my just the one I really just kind of like respected the most. His story was the most inspirational anyway. But you had, some of the generational folks were just a riot. You had some of the folks who go down there. One of them called a seagull, climb up on top of a periscope on top of a sub to catch a seagull to bring him as a pet, and had to be told to let go. Now one called a seagull, put in a desk of it, frightening crap out of one of his supervisors. They scared the crap out of one guy by putting him into a submarine and said they were doing tests, and they sprayed him with water. Came out screaming. Things like that. They're a bunch of jokesters, a bunch of big kids. They really were. They're a lot of fun to hang around.
That's terrific. Well, any more questions? Yes. I thought that's what else had their hands
I had this great description of how a nuclear power plant works. I really did. I just thought I really put it down to everyone just thought it was the coolest thing, and that was on the cutting room floor. So when we start the book, we were going to end the book with the christening of the ship, the launch and the christening. We thought that would be a nice little, kind of wrap it all up. And then COVID hit, and we're like, wow, not for anything, but how do you build a carrier during COVID? So we said, we're going to expand this book and everything like that. I said, yeah, write more, write back. So I got workers who almost died from COVID, in the book. Amazing stories about that kind of stuff. And so, it came out with basically, it was supposed to be about 70,000, 80,000 words. And they said, yeah, write more. So I came up with about 120,000 words. And then the editor said, can't be more than 90. So I spent the last month just basically every night just cutting down. That was one of them. There were a lot, I thought, some really cool descriptions. there were a couple characters here and there who I thought, shine a light in different things. But basically in the end, I said, what keeps the narrative going? And that's why I focus on what kept the narrative going. And the narrative was, you got to get this ship built. We've got to do it with all this fear of manpower, hanging over our heads, and with this pandemic coming down and everything else, we got to get the ship built. And whatever kept that narrative going, stayed in. What didn't, I just got to cut it out.
It's the writer's life, unfortunately.
It is. Kill the babies, they say.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and I appreciate your attendance. Thank you, Mike, very much for being here, and thank you for the book. The book is Heavy Metal: The Hard Days and Nights of the Shipyard Workers Who Build America's Supercarriers. Thank you very much for being here, Mike. We appreciate it, and we appreciate all of you viewing tonight, and thank you for coming to the Hudson Institute.
I'll add one thing to this, because my family does have to get the last word. So you clapping for me, but really you should be clapping for the folks in this book. Because I got to tell you, all I did was tell their stories. And that's the God's honest truth. I'm not trying to be falsely humble here. I just told their stories. Their stories are amazing. What they do is amazing. And that's how I really just wanted to get out, was what they do and how they do it, because it's important.
Thanks, Mike.
So, thanks, Bryan. This was great.
Appreciate it.